So, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. And again, as Matt said, thank you very much for the organizing committee for putting all this together and certainly for giving me the opportunity to stand up in front of you for a little while this morning. They were kind enough not to give me any clear direction on what they wanted me to speak about. So what I did is I just put together some thoughts. This will be a kind of a collection of anecdotes and aphorisms and just sort of general thoughts that I've learned in the time that I've done a little bit of work around innovation. So let's start with a quick, whoops. I'm going to need Brian's help. You can't have an innovation or digital strategy or anything like that conversation without some IT problems, right? I mean, it's the magic of the world of innovation is that it gets ahead of us. Good. So, quick introduction about me. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Those of you who don't know why I'm putting this picture up, ask somebody else, they'll explain it to you. But there's a television show with a guy named Mike Ross on it. So those of you who thought that he would be here today speaking, I'm sorry you're stuck with me. Perhaps more interestingly, a quick introduction about me. So I do a bunch of work around innovation. And I was at McKinsey for a little while, did a bunch of different things, and really got interested in this notion of innovation and creativity. And what's particularly interesting to me is less this notion of how do you come up with ideas, right? The creativity side of it, and much more the realization side of it, right? What is it that companies have to do? What is it that individuals have to do to be more innovative, right? And I really believe this idea that innovation is creativity realized. I really believe that there's sort of two big parts to it. And I think that these days we spend a lot of our time thinking about the creativity side of it. We spend a lot of our time thinking about how do you come up with really cool ideas, and perhaps not as much time as we should on the realization. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about creativity. I'm going to talk a little bit about ideas. You know, you can't talk about innovation without thinking about how do you come up with really good ideas. I'm also going to talk a little bit about making stuff, right? Like, what is it that you need to do to be able to actually do things, right? And what are the skill sets that are necessary in order to take an idea and actually make it work, right? So in this world of today, there really is no shortage of ideas, but the shortage I find, at least in the work that I do with my clients, is around how do I take an idea and how do I translate it into action. And then I'm also going to spend some time actually knowing that the great majority of us here today are students, thinking about what all this means for students, right? What all this means for us as we're in this moment of transition, going from an academic perspective into more a professional perspective, right? And so what are some of the things that, if I could be allowed humbly, that I would suggest that you guys think about as you go through that process, right? So fundamentally, there's really two things that matter, right? There's just two things, I think, that are the most important ingredients to all of this stuff. These are my kids. So the two things that matter for me, at least, are these two things. But really, the two things I think that are really important for us to think about as people, as innovators, as companies, as organizations, as academic institutions, as we think about becoming more innovative, realizing that creativity, are perspective and evolution. And what I'll do is I'll just talk a little bit about each one. So what do I mean when I'm talking about perspective? What I'm thinking about is not just this idea that, like, I need to be able to look at the world, or I need to be able to stand in somebody else's shoes to see the world. But really what I mean is that you need to be able to completely change the way you perceive things, right? This is known as, I mean, at McKinsey, they use this idea of lenses. You have to be able to look at the world in different lenses. People use the idea of viewpoints. It depends on who you talk to, but the idea is always the same. That one of the things that holds us back as innovators, one of the things that holds us back when we're trying to really change stuff, is that we're so used to thinking of the world in the way that we think about it. So I'll talk a little bit about perspective first. When we're thinking about ideas, what is it that we need to do to come up with really good ideas? Well, what we really need to do is we need to get out of our own heads, right? So my first story for today is a story about a woman in a grocery store. We did a project for a client. It was a very large American grocery company, as a supermarket company, and they wanted to think about how it is that people move through their grocery stores. And how can they change the way their stores are laid out in order to encourage people to move in particular ways and buy particular things, right? Obviously, there's some high margin items that they want you to focus on. It's called actually path and dwell analysis. There's a whole science around this. And the way that we did this project is we interviewed people, right? And we didn't interview them and say, how do you move around supermarkets? We did this thing called an ethnography, which I'm sure a lot of you folks who do innovation have heard of before, have probably done as well. But the idea is that you actually go and you follow somebody. You study them in their own environment. So we're standing in this woman's, not this woman, but a woman's kitchen together, and she's making her shopping list. Right? She's writing down all the things she needs to buy. I got to get eggs, got to get milk. She's looking in the cupboards, looking in the fridge. And she says, I'm very disciplined, right? I don't mess around. I go into the supermarket, I've got a list, I know what I'm going to get, I get in and I get out. How many of you guys are like that? How many of you shop like that in supermarkets? How many of you have a clear idea of what it is you're going to buy, and you're like, I don't want to waste time in the supermarket. I'm just going to go buy some stuff, and I'm going to get out. Right? And then there's a whole other crew of people, right, who are like, I just go to the supermarket, and I'll get inspired, right? I'll just see what I have, and let's see what they've got, and what's on special. How many people do that? Yeah, see, this is why my wife and I don't go to the supermarket together anymore, right? Because I'm like, okay, now what, right? And she's like, I don't know, let's go see what's in this aisle. I'm like, there's nothing in this aisle on our list, right? Anyway, so we're in this supermarket with this woman, and she shops, and she gets all the stuff on her list, and she's ticking it off. She's a very, very well-organized, very efficient woman. And she stops. And she stops in that aisle that has all these, like, snacks and cookies and chips and things like that, right? The sin aisle, I like to think of it, right? It's that aisle that, like, you don't ever want to go through it, but you always do. And she's just standing there, and she's just looking at this wall of, like, gummy bears and jujubes and nuts and things like that. And I said, what are you doing, right? None of this is on your list. There's nothing happening on this list. You're an efficient shopper. What are you doing standing here? And she said, yeah, but I've been so good. I just deserve a little reward. And that, to me, that's where good ideas come from, right? Is this notion of, like, I don't think like that. But having been in her presence and feeling her thinking like that, right? And trying to think to myself, well, what does that mean about what it is that these people are doing? That gets me out of this perspective that I have on the world that forces me to think supermarkets should be organized as linearly as possible, right? Whereas even that person who, to me, seemed to be very similar to me when I first met her, right? I thought she's an efficient shopper, I'm an efficient shopper. Her underlying needs, right? That emotional connection that she has to that action that she takes is very different than mine. And so that's the first thing, right? As you're coming up with really interesting ideas, you've got to figure out a way to get out of your own head and into other people's, right? And I know that today in some of the workshops, I know that Amanda and Jade and Sarah are going to talk a little bit about inspiration. I think that Trevor is going to talk about design thinking, things like that. A lot of the fundamental ideas in a lot of those processes is this idea of how do you get out of your own head, right? How do you get out of your own kind of blinker view of how the world must work and really come up with something that's truly transformational and interesting? But again, for me, a much more interesting question is the company level, the organizational level, right? What does an organization have to do this? I can say to the organization, go do a bunch of interviews, follow people around supermarkets, watch them use their washing machines, all that thing, but there's more than that, right? And what I think is, it's all about teams, right? I did a little tour. Andre was nice enough to walk me around upstairs. The Queen's MBA program is amazing for the focus that you guys have on teams, right? You know, I don't know if you all, those of you who are MBA students know this very well, but those of you who are not, they're assigned a team of 6 people. They're given a team room, which is a little room where they all sit. They have study carrels, and that's it. For the next 6 months, they're together. That's a fascinating opportunity to learn how to function well as a team, right? And I said to Andre, I said, man, like, that sounds like danger zone, right? Because I know from my MBA program, we get to craft our own teams, but there's sometimes you just end up with somebody on your team, and you're like, we just don't work together. It just doesn't work, things like that. And he said, yeah, actually, you know what? Surprisingly, it works out really well. And I said, how do they manage to get that right? And he said, they spend a lot of time thinking about the composition of the team. And what is it they're looking for when they're composing their teams is diversity, right? They're looking for different perspectives. And I really believe that to make really great teams, what you need is that diversity of perspective, right? This is a picture, obviously, of the New Zealand All Blacks, the best rugby team in the world. What I think is fascinating, particularly about this, you know, people talk a lot about Scrum innovation, right? Now, the idea of Scrum innovation, the reason why it's called Scrum, have you all heard of Scrum innovation before, right? Scrum, agile manufacturing processes. It's a notion of that you do short sprints, and you do it with cross-functional teams. So you get teams together that have different skill sets, right? So rather than having engineering work really well on designing the product, and then they hand it over to the people who are going to produce it, and then once it's produced, then they hand it over to the marketing team, and they say, okay, now go sell it. You have all those people working together throughout the process to make something happen. It's named after a rugby scrum. It's named after a part of rugby because the original idea was that the whole group moves forward together, right? If you ever watched a series of rugby backs as they move up the field, they're passing the ball off down the line, and everybody's moving up together. But I think the much more interesting reason, or perhaps the much more interesting way to tie this to rugby, is this notion of diversity, right? Because in a rugby team, you need some gigantic people who are going to be in the scrum and push the ball forward in a very sort of plodding, methodical, directive way. And then you need these very light, very small, very sort of, I don't know, dynamic, almost dancers who can run around in the backfield and actually pick up the ball and take it through to the goal. And so fundamentally, how do you build great teams? It's through diversity, right? And it's not sort of superficial joking, oh yes, we have diversity, but it's a real understanding of how people think and making sure that you have different people who think in different ways working together on problems. That's the great, it sounds like the great benefit of the program that you guys have all experienced here, but it's also something that we're really pushing our clients to do a lot these days, which is saying, how can you make sure that the people that are working on this problem are going to think about it in a completely different way? Because if you really want to come up with something interesting, if you want to execute on a completely new product, you have to have that diversity of opinion and perspective. So what does that mean for all of you as students, right? What does that mean for you as people who are going to go into the working world? Well, I've got good news and I got bad news. The good news is that confusing resume that you worry about being a liability for you and you think, oh, geez, I did a little bit of this, I did a little bit of that, actually is the thing that people are looking for now, right? This notion of loyalty to an employer, which 5 years ago was starting to go away, I think is completely dead now. And a lot of my clients, when we finish the project that we do with them, say, okay, great, but how do I hire people who can think in these ways, right? How do I find those people? And I always say you want to look for those people who have a completely wide skill set. Right? That they can do all sorts of different things. They've experienced different things because that experience is what's going to give them those different angles of looking at problems. The bad news? Well, the bad news, they expect you to be good at everything. So this is probably a little bit too old for a lot of you. This is a picture of a guy named Bo Jackson. Who remembers Bo Jackson? Right. Yeah. Right. Bo knows hockey, right? Bo Jackson was still is an amazing athlete, but in the 90s was both an all-star football player, so he was a professional NFL football player on the all-star team, and an all-star baseball player. So he played professional football and professional baseball at the same time. The problem with today's workplace is that everybody wants you to be amazing at everything you do, right? So the takeaway from that is, one is all sorts of different experiences are great and wonderful and amazing. The other thing is be really good at stuff, right? So really push yourself into the things that you do. Really throw yourself into them. Even if there's something that doesn't seem to be related to what it is that you think an employer is looking for. Because the smart employers, the really switched on ones, are the ones who are going to see the fact that you are actually an amazing flamenco guitarist and say, that's valuable for us. Not, of course, that we want you to play guitar in the office all day long, but the fact that you drove yourself to be excellent at this thing is an incredibly powerful and useful thing. When I look at resumes, when we're looking at resumes to hire people, the thing that I think is often the most interesting, the most valuable part is that little part at the end that people put interests, right? And sometimes we talk to MBA students at McGill and we're helping to coach them on how to get jobs and stuff like that. And their interests are like, I like traveling, right? I'm like, everybody likes traveling, right? So what is it that you do? Well, actually, what I really like to do is I like to hike up mountains. And I've done almost all the biggest mountains in the Northeast, right? I did all of Vermont, New Hampshire, things like that. That's interesting for me, right? So I guess part of this is don't be afraid to shine, right? Don't be afraid to let those things that you are particularly interested in, those things that really drive you, the things that you are Bo Jackson at, don't be afraid to show those to people. All right, so that's perspective. Now let's talk about the next thing, and it's evolution, right? Anybody know the story of the peppered moth? A couple of folks? All right, if I get this wrong, tell me after the speech, all right? So this is a peppered moth. This is the way that peppered moths usually look. It's peppered, right? Get it? Yeah, the peppered moth. Great. Early 19th century England, right? So the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they do a study, I think it was like 1811 or something like that, and they're counting the number of peppered moths. And how many black peppered moths do they find? None. Like less than 1%. They find a couple and they think it's interesting. They say, oh, this is interesting, right? This is just at the beginning of the understanding of evolution, things like that. Industrial Revolution takes off, of course, right? What does the Industrial Revolution depend on? What is it based on? Coal. Right? What does coal do when you burn it, especially back in those days? It makes stuff black. Right? So then they go, in 1895, they count the number of peppered moths. This is in Birmingham, in England, which is one of the centers of the Industrial Revolution. They count them, and what do they see? Almost all the peppered moths are black now. Why is that? It's because that the natural predator of peppered moths, the reason why peppered moths are peppered, is because usually on white buildings or birch trees or things like that, they could hide like this. As Industrial Revolution takes off, everything gets covered in soot, everything turns black, those pepper moths are dying and these ones are surviving. So the fundamental idea, and this is by no means a new idea, right, is that you have to evolve. Right? Why is it that we're talking about innovation so much these days? Right? Why is innovation such a big deal? Why is this such a common word all the time? The reason is that the world is changing too quickly. The world is changing so fast now that companies can't keep up, especially big companies, right? Because they have structures and processes and all these things. And so the thing that they're struggling with the most is this ability to change and be new and renew themselves. So why does that matter? Well, that matters because if you're a company like this, you're not going to be around for very long, right? So you have to create. And really good companies are the ones who are actually creating this version of themselves already, right? That are jumping ahead of themselves, right? You take somebody like Alec Morley, who works at TD, right? He's thinking about how can TD create digital attacking platforms, right? How can they do things that really transform the way banking is done, right? And the really bold companies are the ones who are saying, all right, black peppered moth, you should survive, let this one die, right? Let this one go away. Because the reality is that if we try and keep both of these, if we try and keep our legacy company, if we try and maintain whatever it is that we were doing before, then both of us are going to be doomed. So what does this mean for ideas? This is a picture, this is the kind of picture that we all want to be in, right? If you can get yourself in a picture like this someday, you're very happy, right? This is a startup from Montreal. This guy here is a guy named Dan Robichaud. He started up this company called Password Box. Right? And these are them in, I think it was November 2013. They just gotten a $6 million Series A funding round. So they're pretty happy at that point. Why do I say don't even love the problems? Often when you talk to innovators, right, they'll say, don't fall in love with your ideas, fall in love with the problem. Right? Well, my thinking is you shouldn't fall in love with anything, right? Except for maybe your kids and stuff, but anyway. But the idea is that what these guys did, so Dan came up with this idea. I think he had a friend of his who was young and unfortunately passed away, right? And all of us, we all have these social media accounts, we have bank accounts, we have all this stuff all over the place, right? And his friend passed away, and his friend's family were trying to figure out how to deal with all these places, and they couldn't get access to any of his accounts, right? Because he had the passwords and he hadn't told them, and so they couldn't figure it out. So Dan had this idea, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this system where you can put all your passwords in some place, and then when you die, people just need one password, which you'll give them, you know, in the event of my death. Here's my master password or something. And then that can open it up, and then they can access your accounts and close your Facebook and all these kind of things. Well, the unfortunate thing about that, right, this is the problem he's trying to solve, right? The unfortunate thing about that is people don't like to think about death, right? And especially not the young people who are at the prime of this kind of password accumulation process that we're all in, right? Of this social media growth and all this stuff. They don't like to think about it, right? Quick show of hands, how many of you have life insurance? Yeah, right, exactly. Okay, a couple of you young people, fantastic. But like most of you are like, life insurance? What are you, crazy? Right? What do I need life insurance for? This is the problem that he confronted, right? So he had a really interesting idea, but the problem was that there was the problem, although it is a real problem, just nobody was interested in his idea as a solution to that. So what did he do? Well, he changed the problem. Right? The problem then became, okay, well, we've got all these passwords. then how can I monitor and manage them all, right? How can I create some sort of system by which I can have one password that unlocks them all, right? Very Lord of the Rings kind of idea. Password Box was sold to Intel in 2014 for an undisclosed amount, but if their Series A was 6 million, I bet you they're jumping a little bit higher now, right? What the point, though, is that he evolved his thinking. He evolved his thinking beyond the idea that he had, and he evolved his thinking beyond the problem that he was trying to solve. He allowed the idea, the problem, the solution, all those things to change as he went forward. And that's the key, right? When you're thinking about coming up with new ideas, you've got to let those things change. Don't fall in love with that stuff. Don't get caught up in that. Don't get caught up in yourself, right? Oh, I've come up with this amazing idea. We've got to figure out a way to make it happen. No, right? I've come up with an amazing idea. Great. How can it actually happen in the world? When it confronts, when it bangs up against the reality of what's happening in the world, what changes? What becomes new? What becomes even more exciting? As an organization, as a company, what does that mean? Going back to my moths, you've got to be willing to let parts of your business die. So way back in history, 1998, there's a guy named Cor Boonstra. Cor is the head of Philips, which is a lighting company. We probably all have heard of it. It's located in Amsterdam. He's sitting there, and funnily enough, Philips at that time owned a small little company that was called Polygram Entertainment. So what does a lighting company own a music company? I don't know. It was just an accident of history. But Philips owned Polygram Entertainment, which at the time was actually a very big and powerful music record company. Somebody shows Cor Boonstra a mini disc, right, which is a technology that is still around but kind of came and then went away. But it was a recordable, like a mini CD that was recordable. So somebody shows this to Cor, he thinks about it for a second, and then he jumps on a plane. He jumps on a plane, he flies to New York, and he sells Polygram Entertainment to Seagram. He sells it to them for $10.6 billion. This is Polygram at the peak of its success, right? And he sells it right then. Why? Because when he saw that mini disc and he realized that people could create their own compilations of albums, he said the music industry is finished. Right? He had that vision to see that, and he said, we're going to get totally out of this business. Sold it to Seagram for $10.6 billion. Seagram, as those of you who are business historians will know, had a lot of troubles. Ended up selling pieces of Polygram to different people, but most of it was sold to Vivendi a few years later for pennies. Well, I mean, billions, but pennies relative to the $10.6 billion that they paid for it. And actually, part of this was the end of Seagram as a company. So what's important here is you need to be willing, as an organization, to kill whole parts of your business. You need to be willing to get out of whole parts of your business. And actually, often, you're going to try to get out at the time when the business is doing its best. We talk to clients, and clients are like, what are you talking about? We're making so much money off that. Why would I do that differently? Right? There's a great chart. I promised myself I wouldn't show you any charts, but there's a great chart of the rise of WhatsApp and the decline of SMS messaging. Right? So you go see a big telecom player, and you say, hey, telecom player, you've got to give SMS texting away for free. You know what they're going to say? This is our biggest profit center. Right? Our margins on texting are so immense, we can't do it. We can't do it. I said, if you don't give it away for free now, somebody's going to kill you, right? And then nobody's going to use the service anymore. And so the point of this is you've got to be willing to get out. You've got to be willing to move from one business to another. So last story for today. What does that mean for you as students? What does that mean for you as individuals? So there's an analyst in Boston at McKinsey who's a vegetarian, right? This is a few years ago. He's a vegetarian and he loves to cook, right? He really loves cooking. This is a guy who did very well in school, did a bunch of other things, right? His resume said all sorts of fancy accomplishments, and probably the last little line it said interests, cooking, vegetarian food, right? So what does he do? He starts, you know what, I really love cooking, and actually I don't really love being a consultant. I know, you're all shocked, right? Yes, okay. So he's like, I don't really love this lifestyle, right? I don't really enjoy hotel food, right? It's like, air miles, okay, but still. Anyway, so he says, I don't really love being a consultant, but I love cooking. And so what I think a lot of people would say is, you know what you should do? Live your dreams, right? Live your passions, follow your passions. quit your job and start a company. But he didn't do that. What he did was he started cooking. So he works. His nights off, he'd invite his friends over and he'd cook meals for them. And his friends would be like, yeah, this is really good. And he'd say, what was good about it? Well, I really like this part. I didn't like this part. He does that for a little while. He's still working. And then somebody says, hey, I'm getting married. Would you mind cooking for my wedding? Well, of course, no problem, right? So he takes maybe a couple of days off work, does this big job. It goes great. What did you guys like? What didn't work? What was the most exciting part of this? All this sort of thing, right? What is he doing? He's learning, right? And what is he doing? To use another hackneyed innovation phrase, he's iterating. Right? Still at McKinsey, still working, but in his spare time, he's trying this stuff out, right? He's trying these things, very lo-fi piloting of a solution. The solution to what? The solution to what he should do with his life, right? This isn't a business problem. This is his life. He's trying to figure out what he should do with his life. Does he enjoy this? Does he like being in a kitchen trying to prepare food for 50 people all at once, right? Does it make him happy? Does it make him happy to go in and try to now sell some of those catering projects, right? To go in and actually develop clients. Does he enjoy that? Maybe he doesn't enjoy it so much, but is it not so painful that it makes him not want to do this as a job? He actually kind of enjoys it. He likes it. He's catering. Things are going well. He hires somebody. How's that? Okay, he has an employee. How does it work? What's it like? He's doing that. It's growing. At a certain point, he says, and takes the big leap off the edge, quits McKinsey and starts a real catering company. Things are going well. Then what he does, this is where we get to our picture. He buys a food truck, right? He buys a food truck, and he starts putting his food truck in different places around Boston and Cambridge, which is the city right next to Boston, and trying out, this menu changes every single day, right? He's trying different things. He's seeing, what do people buy? What do they not buy? He's always asking his customers, right? His staff is cooking. He's standing around. Did you enjoy that? What did you like? What did you? Is it too expensive? That kind of thing. At the same time, he's trying out different locations to see where there are enough people who want to buy this sort of fast vegetarian cuisine that he actually can make a business out of it. So fast forward now. I don't know if any of you are from or been to Boston recently. If you are, if you go back, you should go see it. There's 5 of these now, 5 restaurants. It's called Clover, right? Tremendously successful. But why is he so successful? Because he didn't say, I have an idea, okay, let's go do that. I'm going to go live my dream. What he did was he said, I have the beginning of an idea, and I'm going to let that idea grow. Right? So I know that a lot of you in MBA programs think, I have to be this now, or I have to be that now. Right? I think the more interesting question is, what can I learn, and what can I learn from as an experience, and what's going to give me the greatest experience and the greatest growth opportunities to move towards whatever it will be. And the reality is that there's no way to predict what the future will hold. Right? And so the only thing that I would say to you all, my last kind of soapbox, this is a very large soapbox, but my soapbox piece of advice is be like Bo Jackson, but also try not to be like the Bo Jackson that we want you to be. Right? Be like the Bo Jackson that you want yourselves to be, and learn and grow and innovate, realize the creativity that is your own lives, and that is your businesses, and that allows you to come up with the most interesting and execute really cool ideas. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you all very much.